Now, Syria, as we know it, is not just another country. In fact, it is one of the first places that most of us learned about when studying history in school. Damascus and Aleppo are among the oldest continually inhabited cities on the face of the earth. They are part of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. For 4,000 years, empires have risen and fallen, but Syria has remained a commercial crossroads. And this has contributed to a rich cultural mix of ethnicities, customs, and creeds. But the story of modern Syria has been a grim one. In 1970, a Ba'athist military leader, Hafez al-Assad, seized power, ushering in an era of limited modernization accompanied by unlimited repression. In the year 2000, Assad was succeeded by his son, Bashar, raising hopes for the possibility of greater political openness, hopes that the new leader chose not to fulfill. It was little wonder then that when the sparks of Arab Spring began to ignite, demands for change were heard in Syria. The protests were actually quite modest at first, and they were driven not by sectarian or religious differences, but by the lack of freedom and jobs. The violence only began when Assad responded to peaceful demonstrations by sending in thugs to beat up young people. And when the parents of those young people objected, and they took to the streets themselves, the regime replied with bullets and then with bombs. Having made peaceful change impossible, Assad made war inevitable. And this war gave rise to Daesh, ISIL, the gravest extremist threat faced by our generation and the embodiment of evil in our time. The result, as we know, has been 4.5 years of non-stop horror. 1 Syrian in 20 has been wounded or killed. 1 in 5 is a refugee. 1 in 2 has been displaced. The average life expectancy dropped by 20 years. 80% of the electricity has been knocked out, plunging much of the country literally into darkness. And the burden of the conflict falls most heavily on the smallest shoulders. Imagine what it would mean for America's future if the entire public school systems of our largest cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, were suddenly to close and stay closed. And then there are children like 2-year-old Yazan al-Najjar, whose birth in Lebanon could not be registered because his parents were separated during the war. Officially, he is neither Syrian, like his mother, nor Lebanese. And there are thousands like him. Young people growing up in camps, many of them without education, growing up in overcrowded apartments, under bridges and in the streets, without a country to call their own or any official identity at all. Make no mistake, the longer this terrible civil war lasts, the harder it will be for the country to recover, and the more wounds of body and mind we will see opened, wounds that can never be truly closed. Since the fighting began, and as Senator and as Secretary of State, I have met with many of those personally touched by this conflict. Doctors who are risking their lives in a country where treating the injured can be equated with treason. Women who struggle to keep their families together despite constant attacks, threats of abuse, bitter cold, shortages of water and food. A courageous whistleblower who emerged from Syria with photographic evidence of the torture that Assad security forces inflicted on thousands of victims. And just a few weeks ago, with refugees, I've talked to those refugees too, who had survived barrel bombs dropped from helicopters and made their way to Berlin, Germany.